the confused explosions of the outrageous effrontery of a tactless young man. This symphony is a danger to the musical art, a prodigal use of the most barbarous dissonances, and a noisy use of all the instruments. Alas, the ear is only stabbed. There is no appeal to the heart. Well, it's almost comical looking back over 200 years later to read the reviews from respected musical critics in Vienna that fine spring day in the year 1800 when Beethoven's First Symphony had its world premiere. We have to remember, notwithstanding those comments, and there were many of them, that Beethoven as a young man, he had just reached the age of 30, was not yet the Beethoven we would all know and recognize. This is not yet that slovenly, sour-tempered, unshaven, volatile personality whose foibles were forgiven for the simple fact that he was a genius. No, this is the young Beethoven, a brilliant young man arrived from Bonn, from humble beginnings, it must be said, but who by 1800 had firmly established himself into the finest aristocratic circles of musical Vienna. Beethoven had by this point charmed that most musical of cities. He had the imprimatur from his teacher, then still alive, the great Franz Joseph Haydn, and when he wrote this First Symphony, he was admired all over the city as a dashing, brilliant young pianist and composer. So by the time Beethoven wrote his very first symphony in 1800, although the sketches for it actually date as far back as the mid-1790s, it always has to be remembered that Beethoven was not a Mozart. He did not write directly into score. Beethoven had to struggle with music just like the rest of us. So for every substantial work, there are reams of sketches and revisions. But this Symphony No. 1 of Beethoven with the exception of just a couple of moments, literally could not be more in the great Viennese classical tradition of symphonic music. Beethoven was merely using this First Symphony as a kind of calling card that he too could swim in the waters that his forebears of Haydn and Mozart had done so brilliantly. But aside from, again, a couple of rather bizarre moments that evidently stoked the unending ire of the music critics, this is an incredibly conservative and straightforward work. Again, a very polite debut for this young Beethoven, who is again still the dashing young man of musical Vienna. There is a very, very strange, ambiguous opening in the slow introduction to the first movement of this, again, utterly typical late classical style symphony. An ambiguous series of chords which have no direction until we finally get on our merry way to the home key of C major. Again, C major, no sharps, no flats, truly the simplest and clearest of all the keys. There's a similarly strange beginning in the slow introduction to the last movement, the fourth movement, where once again, for a few measures, we have absolutely no idea as to where Beethoven is going. But again, soon enough, he settles back comfortably into a C major sonata allegro form. The first and last movements, again, are so conventional. Compared to the late symphonies of his teacher, Joseph Haydn, they are conventional. The second movement, this jolly little slow movement that's really not very slow at all, again, by the standards of late Haydn and Mozart, just building blocks. But it's the scherzo. It's the scherzo that we have that sense of danger. For here in the third movement is not a stately minuet in 3/4 time, boom, chick, chick, boom, chick, chick. But no, this is something different and entirely new. It is a scherzo, a quick dance in one, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. This must have driven audiences crazy because this was something they'd never heard before. Although, again, Beethoven always drawing on sketches, Beethoven had written some dances like this for a fancy dress ball in Vienna a few years before, and nobody noticed. But is that moment of danger in the scherzo that must have really unsettled many people in those early audiences for the premiere of this piece. But now we accept it for what it is, the musical calling card to the whole world of this young man who would go on to be perhaps the very greatest of composers. It's so much fun to introduce what is such a wonderful, lighthearted, good-humored, but brilliant performance of this Symphony No. 1 of Beethoven. It dates from the 1980s. Sir George Solti, one of our great honorary Midwesterners, went to London with his great Chicago band, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, to perform at that glorious series of summer concerts in London at the Royal Albert Hall, affectionately known as the Proms. Their original title is the Promenade Concerts, but everyone calls them the Proms. And I want you to notice in the moments before the performance takes place that on the entire floor of the vast space known as the Royal Albert Hall, what they call the arena, everyone is standing. All thousands of young people who stand, there are no chairs, they stand through the entire performance. It's literally like a rock concert. And I will never forget those happy days I spent as a graduate student at Cambridge University when I would take the train down to London and sleep on friends' floors and just, I don't know how we all stood up for all those 3 hours of the concerts, but you will see the infectious enthusiasm of these wonderful young audiences. And you realize that there is nothing snooty or elitist at all about classical music. So a great performance of this great Beethoven symphony and a beautiful example of the English at their best from the London Proms, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, Sir George Solti conducting Ludwig van Beethoven's First Symphony.